You know the type. He's 35, maybe 40. He still avoids difficult conversations. Still blames other people when things go wrong. Still treats responsibility like an inconvenience rather than a normal part of life. When bills pile up, someone else handles them. When relationships become complicated, he disappears. When mistakes happen, there's always an excuse. And somehow, despite being an adult in every legal sense, he often seems emotionally frozen in time. People have a name for this type of person, the man-child. But that label creates a problem, because labels make behavior look simple. And this behavior is anything but simple. The real question isn't why some men act immature. The real question is why some men never seem to complete a psychological transition that most people assume happens automatically. Because growing older is automatic. Growing up is not. And psychology suggests that the difference between those two things explains far more than most people realize. Most people assume these men are simply lazy, irresponsible, selfish, immature, and sometimes those descriptions are partially true. But they don't explain the deeper question. Why would someone repeatedly avoid the very behaviors that make adulthood possible? Why would a person resist responsibility even when that resistance damages relationships, careers, finances, and self-respect? Why continue a pattern that clearly creates problems? Psychology often becomes interesting when a behavior appears irrational on the surface, but begins making sense once you understand what purpose it serves underneath. And that's where this story starts. Because refusing to grow up is rarely about refusing adulthood itself. More often, it's about refusing something adulthood represents. Responsibility, vulnerability, accountability, loss, the end of psychological escape routes. Many people imagine maturity as gaining freedom. But psychologically, maturity often feels like surrendering certain freedoms. As children, mistakes are expected. As adults, consequences arrive faster. As children, someone else carries much of the burden. As adults, the burden increasingly becomes yours. For some men, that transition feels manageable. For others, it feels threatening. Not because they're incapable, but because something in their psychological development taught them that responsibility is associated with pain. Here's where things get interesting. Many men who struggle with adulthood are not avoiding responsibility because they're weak. They're avoiding responsibility because responsibility activates something deeper. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of inadequacy. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as self-protective avoidance. If you never fully commit, you never fully fail. If you never take ownership, your identity remains protected. If you never step into responsibility, you never have to discover whether you're capable of handling it. Think about the student who never studies but claims he could have succeeded if he wanted to. The employee who never tries but insists the system is unfair. The partner who never commits but says they simply haven't found the right person. On the surface, these behaviors look different. Underneath, they often share the same function. They protect the person from confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves. And sometimes adulthood itself becomes part of that confrontation. Because adulthood asks a difficult question. Who are you when excuses are removed? For some people, that's empowering. For others, it's terrifying. Researchers studying emotional development have repeatedly found that people don't simply mature because time passes. They mature because they repeatedly encounter challenges that force adaptation. Responsibility becomes a training ground. Conflict becomes a teacher. Failure becomes information. But what happens when someone spends years avoiding those experiences? What happens when every challenge is escaped, delayed, outsourced, or blamed on someone else? Development slows. Not intellectually. Not physically. Psychologically. A person can accumulate decades of life experience while avoiding many of the emotional experiences that produce maturity. This sounds strange, but age and adulthood are not always moving at the same speed. You can meet a 22-year-old who feels remarkably grounded, and you can meet a 45-year-old who still reacts to disappointment like a teenager. The calendar doesn't determine emotional growth. Experience does. And more importantly, how someone processes that experience. Now here's the part nobody talks about. Some men don't avoid adulthood because they love childhood. They avoid adulthood because childhood never felt finished. Maybe responsibility arrived too early. Maybe they spent years caring for others before they were ready. Maybe emotional needs were ignored. Maybe praise only came through achievement. Maybe mistakes were punished harshly. When this happens, adulthood can feel less like growth and more like a continuation of old burdens. Part of the mind remains focused on needs that were never fully resolved. Psychologists call this developmental fixation. Certain emotional tasks remain unfinished. The body moves forward. Parts of the identity remain stuck. That's why some men appear obsessed with escape. Endless gaming. Constant distractions. Avoidance of serious commitments. Refusal to make long-term decisions. These behaviors are often described as laziness, but many times they're serving a psychological purpose. They provide temporary relief from expectations. A temporary return to a state where consequences feel distant. A temporary suspension of adulthood itself. What if that's not the real problem? What if the real issue isn't that these men refuse responsibility? What if the real issue is that responsibility has become psychologically associated with threat? Because human beings don't avoid effort. They avoid emotional pain. People climb mountains voluntarily, train for marathons, work 80-hour weeks, raise children, build companies, endure enormous hardship. The issue is rarely effort itself. The issue is what the effort represents emotionally. And for some men, responsibility becomes tied to fear. Fear of proving they're inadequate. Fear of disappointing others. Fear of becoming trapped. Fear of losing autonomy. Fear of becoming the very adults they once resented. Suddenly, immaturity starts looking less like a character flaw and more like a defensive strategy. An imperfect strategy. A costly strategy. But a strategy nonetheless. This creates an interesting contradiction. Many men who appear careless are actually highly preoccupied. Many who appear indifferent care deeply. Many who appear irresponsible spend enormous mental energy avoiding feelings associated with responsibility. The behavior is visible. The emotional machinery underneath is hidden. And because it's hidden, people often misunderstand it. They assume the problem is motivation, when sometimes the problem is identity. Because adulthood isn't just a collection of responsibilities. It's an identity shift. You stop seeing yourself as someone being taken care of. You begin seeing yourself as someone capable of taking care of things. Your life, your relationships, your mistakes, your future. That sounds simple. It isn't. Identity forms around repeated experiences. If a person repeatedly experiences competence, they begin identifying as capable. If they repeatedly experience failure, shame, or criticism, they may begin identifying as incapable long before adulthood arrives. And identities tend to protect themselves, even unhealthy ones. A man who secretly believes he's incapable may unconsciously avoid situations that could challenge that belief. Not because he wants to fail, but because uncertainty feels dangerous. At least familiar disappointment feels predictable. Now things get a little uncomfortable. Because society often sends mixed messages to men. On one hand, men are expected to be responsible, competent, reliable, and emotionally stable. On the other hand, many men receive very little guidance on how to develop those qualities psychologically. They're expected to arrive at adulthood already equipped. When they struggle, they're often judged before they're understood. That doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it helps explain it. Understanding is not the same thing as approval. Psychology's job isn't to excuse behavior. It's to explain behavior. An explanation reveals something important. Many men who refuse to grow up are not actually refusing growth. They're refusing the emotional risks that growth requires. Because growth requires failure. Growth requires uncertainty. Growth requires admitting ignorance. Growth requires responsibility. And responsibility forces a confrontation with reality. The reality of who you are. The reality of what you avoid. The reality of what needs to change. That's uncomfortable for everyone. Some people simply become experts at postponing it. The deeper truth is that maturity has very little to do with appearing serious. It has very little to do with age, and surprisingly little to do with external success. Maturity is the willingness to engage with reality even when reality is uncomfortable, to own mistakes, to tolerate uncertainty, to carry responsibilities without constant escape, to accept that freedom and accountability often arrive together. And perhaps that's the biggest misunderstanding of all. People assume growing up means losing freedom. Psychologically, it often means gaining a different kind. The freedom that comes from no longer running. The freedom that comes from accepting responsibility rather than fearing it. The freedom that comes from knowing you can handle difficult things. Because human beings become shaped by whatever repeatedly helps them survive. Some men learned that avoidance felt safer than responsibility. Some learned that excuses felt safer than accountability. Some learned that escape felt safer than growth. Those adaptations made sense at one point. The question is whether they still do. And that's the hidden story behind the man who refuses to grow up. He isn't simply trapped in childhood. He's often trapped in an identity built around avoiding what adulthood asks of him. Not because he's broken, not because he's incapable, but because adaptation sometimes outlives the environment that created it. And perhaps maturity begins the moment that adaptation is finally questioned. Because growing older happens automatically. Growing up begins when a person stops asking how to avoid responsibility and starts asking what kind of person responsibility could help them become.